Okay, so hello again, everyone. And to recap, we just went through a really good design exercise in building out a specification for our application, where we're going to let people create polls and add questions to them and responses to polls, and we're going to see which responses are people's favorites. We got rid of some features like having one correct answer. We decided about things we want to ignore and some stretch features like maybe, starting to worry about users. And we simplified our data model by deciding we're not going to worry about letting questions be reused between polls because that makes life more complicated and it doesn't really make sense right now. I've mentioned this to some people, but one of the great acronyms of software engineering is YAGNI, which stands for you ain't gonna need it. And it's a great rule when building stuff. If you don't need it, don't build it. And the one exception to that is, when you're designing a database, the sort of very guts, the skeleton of your application, some time and care and thought is worth it. Thinking ahead a little bit. These things in real world applications, as the program gets bigger, are the parts that get harder to change. Even there, though, you can change stuff. My rule of thumb is I want to think a couple steps ahead, but really only build one step ahead. And one of the reasons for this is in the real world, even if we realize, hey, we need this feature, we're going to need not just a poll, but a quiz where there's one correct answer. And the business is going to request that in 2 months. Well, by the time that actually happens, the requirements around that may have changed enough where that what we actually need for this is different than what we thought at the time. So there's an advantage to waiting for the need to become real, because then it's much easier to figure out real requirements. One of the risks of kind of like building ahead is you build up what you think you need, and then when you get to the time when you actually need it, you realize we actually need something somewhat different. There's a lot of caveats there. And again, this is more from my experience sort of at startups and stuff. But it's not a bad rule. And the more you write software, the more you realize like until it gets big, it's easy to change. So there's a lot of advantages to keeping it simple. I'm thinking we should dive into starting to build this because we did some really good specking out of things. And I know people want to see the implementation. I am just going to briefly demonstrate a little bit of how to spec out the other parts of our application, the most important part being the routes or the paths. And I'm just going to show a few examples here. And this is sort of my own shorthand. This stands for an HTTP GET request, and this would be the path that we're writing, right? And, it would look something like, something like this. And this one bears special notice because what's really going on here is we're deciding, imagine there's a form, basically. And I'm mixing parts of the design phase here with the templates and the routes. And again, this is where more so I want to demonstrate a bit of a process that's useful at the level of like, I am working on implementing something right now. And just a rough sketch to think about what it might look like when a user actually submits data on this. And there might be some pieces I'm missing, but the basic idea is we're going to have a page. You're going to be able to see the poll. They're the questions. They're going to be sort of select boxes. The user is going to click stuff, hit submit, and that data goes to the back end. And really the most important thing we need is the IDs of the responses that the user selected. The poll ID would be nice. The question ID would be nice. I think we can actually get those from the response based on our data model. So this is all sort of TBD or a work in progress. But again, for me, I found like just sketching stuff out helps get stuff out of my head so that when I'm writing code, I can focus on what I need to do to make the code work. So now I think we want to go ahead and build these models. And I'm just going to go ahead and make a little implementation steps note for myself. We're going to want to spin up a Django project, the virtual env. We're going to need to create a database, configure Django to use our database. We're going to want to create a model or two. And then I'm going to show you how to use the Django shell or REPL to easily insert fake data into our DB. And maybe we'll write some tests for our models as well. So that's the plan. And I'm going to shift into coding now and start to do a little setup. And on that note, just to show everyone where I am right now, I'm in the Django polls app for week 4, day 4. I'm actually going to create a git ignore file right now because I'm just so used to doing that. And this is part of my process. And I like to set up as much of this stuff as I can before I'm starting work. And let me go ahead and get my guide code and we can dive into this. And before I dive into this, do folks have any questions or comments kind of around the modeling that we've been doing or anything like that? All right, let's do this. And I'm going to move a bit more quickly through some of the setup stuff so we can get to the good part. So I'm setting up my virtual environment. And as I'm doing this, someone remind me, does it matter where the virtual environment directory lives for our project? Let's see.
As long as it's outside of it, I'm pretty sure, like one level up.
Yeah, we probably don't want the virtual environment directory in the Django project. And in terms of installing things in Python, it doesn't actually matter where it lives. The convention is put it in the same place where the README is, where your git ignore is, so it'll be at the same level as the Django project directory. And I'm going to go ahead and activate my virtual environment. And by the way, if you hit Control R, I believe it will give you a search through the history of everything you've typed on the command line back. I don't know if it's to infinity, but way back. I'm not 100% if it's the same thing for Windows users, but it very well might be with WSL. And that is an easy helper tool for command line stuff. My other favorite command line is the up arrow and down arrow move through your command history. And I've typed this stuff out a lot, but I also don't have a great memory sometimes. And so that's how I do it. We're going to activate our Django, our Python environment. I see I've got that working here. I'm going to select the Python interpreter, set it to my virtual environment. And now I'm going to go ahead and install Django. And as I'm doing this, who's next on our list? Terry, can you tell me, when I'm installing Django, where did it just get installed to?
into your virtual environment.
Yeah, exactly. And even more specifically, it gets inside that virtual environment directory is a lib directory. And that's where whenever we install something, when the virtual environment is activated, that stuff ends up. And you can see Django's here, pip is here, and so on. And can someone else remind me what makes the link between how did pip know to install that into the virtual environment?
Because where
It
you have it
alters the
activated.
path file.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a little bit of a leading question on my part because I had a really specific answer. Just to remind everyone, when we're in the shell, we get environment variables. And in fact, you know, if I do foo equals hello world and use echo, which is the shell version of print, I get a variable, and path is a special variable that's created for us every time we start a new shell. And that knows where everything is, and activating the virtual environment modifies our path. And I'm going to use the handy dandy Django admin command line utility to start a project. And we're going to name it just polls, I guess.
I had a question actually.
Yeah.
What was that thing you activated? I think it was right after you activated your virtual environment. You went to like the command line and then you selected an interpreter. What was that part?
Oh yeah, totally. So that was actually with VS Code. And if you do Command Shift P or Control Shift P, and by the way, in VS Code, Command P or Control P gives you a search. Though without a lot of code right now, we're not going to get a lot. Command Shift P gives you sort of like this command bar of options for setting various VS Code configuration settings. And if you start typing Python or interpreter, probably the easiest way to do it is just to type Python. You see this option, select interpreter. And this is telling VS Code where to go to find the version of the Python runtime that we want to use. And the reason this matters is because when we're installing stuff with pip and using a virtual environment, we want to point VS Code to the version of Python we have living inside that virtual environment, which I guess you can't see it there. It is somewhere in here, inside bin. Like there's multiple versions of Python installed in various places around my computer right now, and we're using the Python virtual environment to manage it. And doing this helps VS Code with some sort of like type autocomplete, like developer friendly stuff to like give you information about the code you're looking at, and like be a little smart about knowing where imported stuff is from, and get rid of some squiggly lines around that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm going to go ahead and, using the Postgres command line utility, create the polls database. And next thing I'm going to do is open a new tab, log into pSQL, look, make sure that polls exists. It does. And I'm going to connect to it so that I've got it there to look at as we go. And actually, I should install psychopg2, which is going to be the program that talks to the connector between Python and Postgres. And that's been installed. And again, if I want to verify that, I can look in my virtual environment directory. And inside the lib, short for libraries, I see psychopg2. So I know that that got installed. And now we do have to, in our Django program, and Control F or Command F searches through a file in VS Code, which is incredibly useful. We need to tell Django that we're going to be using Postgres and the name of the database. And I know that some folks ran into some other issues around this with Postgres permissions and stuff. And I think that got worked out, or TAs will be chatting with people. But if not, let us know in the afternoon. So I think that should be that. And being someone who's very used to all this, I see. I'm used to just committing to Git like all the time. And this seems like a great point because we've just set up a very basic skeleton. And told it what database to look at. So I'm going to go ahead and commit. And now in my commit log, I have a nice little commit of that step. And if I need to go back to it because I screw something up, I can. And now I am going to go ahead and create the Django app. So I'm inside the Django project directory for polls. And we should really use a better name here. If anyone has a good suggestion for the app name, feel free to share. I'm also doing a bit of Google to see what some good suggestions are. Polls. For the moment, I'll figure out a better name because I know it gets confusing with all this stuff, but we'll just call it how about polls main? Not that much better. Poll R, cap the project name. Yeah, all caps for the project name is not a bad idea. Having the polls in there is really going to see I'm just going to do app main. It's not the best, it's not the worst, but if I look at this, I know it's an app and I know it's the main app. So that's what I'm running with it for the moment. And again, just going through the setup that we need to do here to get our Django project rolling. And now we can start doing the interesting stuff of creating some models. As I said, I'm used to committing to Git every 5 seconds. And in fact, I want to run the server because I want to make sure I haven't missed a configuration step, and I have. And if I had to guess, it's probably related to something with Postgres.
I noticed in some of the previous documentation from other lessons where we use Postgres and Django, it didn't have the base dir and then the database name. It just had the database name.
Oh, thank you. I may have gotten that wrong. I may have totally forgotten that. I think you're probably right. And honestly, that's why I like to run my code as often as possible, because that's a great way to find out when stuff like that happens. That port is already in use, which is a little interesting. And that may just be me having something else running that I forgot I had running, like a different Django program. So give me one moment to resolve that one, and then we'll be able to do it. And I have to do a quick Google to remind myself how to see what is using what port. And to be honest, the quickest way to check this out is I should just go to localhost 8000 and see what's happening. And that's interesting because it's a polls project that's running. So this is actually a good little debugging lesson here, though this wasn't intended. I started my Django server. It's telling me this port 8000 is already in use. Because I know what I've been doing recently, my first thought is I probably started up a different Django app and forgot, and it's still running. I don't have any other terminals open here. I closed out iTerm, and I just went to that port to see what on earth was going on. And it is indeed a Django app. The funny thing is, and in fact, here we've got cats, which is from our lesson like 3 or 4 days ago. So God knows why that Django server is still running. I'm actually a little surprised about that. I don't think I've turned off my laptop in that time. The way to deal with this is we are going to look at all the processes I have running right now. And we are going to look for anything with Python and see what Python processes I have running. And we're going to find that Django server and we're going to kill it. And let's see here. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger. Well, it's hard to make it bigger at the moment. But just to very quickly talk about what's going on here. PS is short for process. When you run it, it prints out all the processes the program's running on your computer. And for some reason, I have like a zillion shells open right now. And you can tell it's a shell or a terminal because it says ZSH. And I'm a little surprised because I'm only seeing 2 here. I closed out iTerm, which should have killed everything else. So I'm not sure where they're coming from, but that's sort of a problem for tomorrow. The ones that we care about are, and a process, by the way, is basically like when you run a program, the computer's got to have some sort of process it uses to keep track of it. And it's not exactly the same as a running program, but there's a bit of a rough mapping. And so what we care about are the processes that are running something with Python, because those are probably the Django ones. And I'm just going to go ahead and kill all of them. And over here, we have the process ID. And so our first one here is 85773. And there is a kill command, and -9 is the force override flag. And so this will most definitely kill that process. And now there should be only 2. And we're just going to go keep doing this with all of them until they're gone. And this last one. And now they're all gone. And now, fingers crossed, the server runs, because there is no other Django server running on that same port. And now we're working. So I apologize for that interlude. Hopefully, if it illustrates anything, it does illustrate the value of like always running your code, because it's way better to run into small problems quickly than wait and then run into a bunch of big ones.
You typed in like number 9. Could you show us like how you decided what number to enter? Because I think a few of us had that same issue. And for me, I just closed out of everything and actually had to like restart my computer, and then it worked.
Yep. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, that was the question. Like how did you decide like to enter the number 9 and then the number after?
Totally. So the answer honestly is you just have to know about it. Which actually, this is a good teaching moment. And by the way, closing everything out and shutting down your computer is also a good strategy, because when you shut down your computer, it's gonna stop all the different like shell instances that you have running. I would have thought that when I quit VS Code and iTerm, it would have quit all of them. I'm not quite sure how they all ended up running in the background. That's a story for another day. But so the kill command is again one of these sort of like built-in shell commands that we get with the shell, with the terminal, the command line. And it's used to kill a process. And I know this because I learned it, is when you use this command, right? Or really any command, when you see like a dash for these kinds of things, I always get that wrong. This one I remember, ls-l, right? The dash is what we call a flag. It's essentially like another argument that's being added to a command line program. And I know because I learned from someone else that what this flag does is override it. Like if you try to kill a process and maybe that process is important for something else or sort of protected in some way, the shell might say like, hey, I'm sorry, I can't kill that process because it's being used by something else or it has a higher priority. -9, that flag says, override everything else, force kill that process, 100% make sure it stops. And honestly, the way to learn that is in a lot of ways, I think you just have to be told it, because it's not realistic to like go through the man pages for things. That is definitely not how I learned this. I think probably from my teacher in some CS course when running into a problem, or from another student. So kill -9 is like from the movie Aliens, the like nuke it from orbit. It's the only way to be sure solution when you absolutely have to stop a process. And in terms of knowing which process to stop, it was actually PID stands for process ID. And that was the important part. So like here, this is a good example. I have pSQL running right now, and that's this other shell right here, right? That's running pSQL. And I see the process ID over here is 67465. So this would probably work. I don't think there's anything really protected about that process right now, and that would stop it and pSQL should exit. If I want to be absolutely certain that that would happen, I would add the -9 flag, and now we're going to kill process number 67465. Now, if I go over here, pSQL has been killed. As you'll know, I'm no longer in pSQL, I'm back in the shell. Yeah, so that's a great question. And again, it's a great thing to know. And it's really one of those things that there's a lot of this stuff that you just pick up the more you do it and the more you're around other people in the field.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we should continue on our journey with building our app. Though I know there's a lot of things we've jumped around doing this, and I need to take a moment to orient myself, see where we were. I should probably also run the Python make migrations command, even though we don't have any models. Let me double check that I've got that. I might hold on that one. I might wait till I create our models. I think the next step is we need to do a little more sort of house cleaning setup work. And we need to, I think we should do a little bit of routing just to get something really simple going, and then we can create our models. And the routing is also there, so we know that the pieces of our program are working together. So what I am going to do is here in our app, sorry, I want to create a file. I'm going to create a URLs py file inside the app. And we're going to add just a tiny bit of stuff to it, just enough to have something basic. Oh, that is definitely not what I wanted. And again, this is just our hello world. This is the squiggly. Oh, this is because it wants a doc string, and I'll make it happy. That squiggly is actually useful because I had a typo. And this squiggly is telling me that there is nothing in here. So I will add something really simple so we have a bit of a view. And I would say like the VS Code autocomplete is your friend because it helps you avoid typos. And I think that's everything we need. And I'm going to make sure that, and again, I have this extension named Black installed that does like linting and formatting. And that's what's telling me, hey, I want you to have like strings for documentation and comments and stuff, which is a good practice. And I actually do recommend installing it. And that should be working. In a moment, if it's not, we'll figure it out. And then we can get to the good part with our models. And this, I guess, is where my app name actually wasn't the best, because now it does get a little confusing. And so now again, I want to run my server, make sure I haven't missed anything. Server seems to run, which is a good start. There's nothing here, which is fine. And this should and I did have a typo. And so that's working, which is great. So again, just a little house cleaning and setup work so we can kind of get down to what we really care about, which is making models for code. And at this point, I am going to take advantage of our split screen. And I think I'm going to put the notes over here. Get rid of these things that we don't care about right now over here. And now I can much more nicely sort of start to organize things. So we need a polls class. And we know that it's going to have questions. And let me double check. So I just did a quick Google search, Django models, singular or plural. The best practice is singular, which I forget sometimes. And even though that's a small thing, that kind of consistency does become useful. We know that the question is going to need a response. So now we've got that. And we know that our response is going to need a description. And let's just use a char field. I'm not even going to worry about setting a max length. Though, and this, by the way, is an advantage of having the Django server running. I do get some nice error messages here. And in fact, char field does require a max length. So we will just do max length equals 200. That might not be enough. I think I want to make mine a bit bigger because we had some fancy questions and I don't want to have to think about if I'm going to run out of space. So just to get things started, I'm just going to make this a text field. And we also had num responses, the number of responses. And I think I'm going to make that a more verbose name because it's going to make things easier to read. And we get a couple interesting choices here. Can anyone share like what might be a good type of Django field to make this, or kind of describe what's our needs here?
I would assume integer.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to go ahead and make it an integer field. We can worry about constraints in a bit. I think we should add a bit of constraints here. What's one constraint that we're going to want here on number of responses? What's an integer value that we don't want?
0.
So
You said
what-
min value at 1.
well, what happens when you're looking at a poll for the very first time? Or when we've created a possible response, but no one has answered it yet?
Oh, okay, it'll be no negatives then.
Yeah, exactly. You're on the right path. 0, and this is a design decision. You could design this in such a way where maybe we didn't create a response model until we had at least one response, especially because we're just storing the description of the response here, though. I think 0 is the appropriate way to model when we have a poll with questions and we haven't gotten any answers yet. And I do have to do a bit of Python writing here. I'm kind of used to doing it this way from JavaScript. So forgive me if this is a little wonky. And in fact, I probably need to import some validators. And I may have gotten a bit confused around our guide code. Yeah, I got a little confused. I was jumping around between guide code and importing from the wrong places, so bear with me for one moment. And whenever you're importing, you really want to be as specific as possible, because that way your editor can help tell you if this was something we had created, everywhere that it's used. And I'm going to use autocomplete to make sure that this import statement seems to be working, which it is.
Brackets.
I do need the brackets. Thank you. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we need to worry about here for number of responses at the moment. I think that's a good start.
Would this be a good place to put in a default value? So we can just start out at 0?
That's a great idea. We absolutely should do that. So this comment is kind of overly verbose and is how, when you read documentation and it's kind of hard to parse, this is how it happens, because some programmer like me is just writing it out very quickly and overly verbosely. So we have min value validator, and let's see. I actually don't know off the top of my head. Can someone remind me how we set a default value on our integer field again?
I think it'll be a proper, like right after integer field inside those parentheses. You could just write default equals 0.
Beautiful. Thank you. Perfect. That was a great call. We've got number of responses at 0. We've got a description. Is there any sort of validation we want to add on our description field for our response model? I would say maybe this, which I think, right, is a constraint. We don't have to add a validator. We probably don't want a response that has no description at all, because that would just be an empty string. And at the moment, I have a hard time imagining if we would ever want that at all. So that's kind of my first thought there. Expected intended block after class definition on line 7. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm going to refer back to our guide code, and we really have most of the things here. And now I think the next step is to flesh out the question. And in fact, I'm just going to borrow this for our description field for the question. I'm just going to use description instead of title. If someone has strong feelings about it, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just leave it. And the next step is we need to link the response and the question together. And can someone remind me, what kind of relationship is this? One-to-one, one-to-many? In sort of plain language, what's the relationship between a question and a response?
One question can have many responses.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And a response can only belong to one question, which we decided. And I'm actually using the lesson from yesterday, Django associations and validators, as my guide code. And I'm sharing this because I think guide code is really your friend, and kind of learning how to use it appropriately is valuable. And I'm looking at how we created the professors and the students and the courses. And I feel like a course and a student is kind of similar. A student can belong to many courses. I mean, we'll worry about that part later, but so I'm thinking it should look something like this. Let's see. Many to one. So we probably need, I think, I can't remember who said it over here, but I think they were right that this is where we need to put the relationship. I might get this wrong, but let's see how this goes. Question equals models dot used by the foreign key field to store information about the relationship. Many to one. I think that is right. Let's see. I could actually use a little help here. If someone can maybe remind me what the best way to set this up. And I'm doing a quick Google search as well, to be honest. And the Django documentation is actually pretty good here. This is the exact type of stuff that was kicking my butt last night. Yeah. So I'll just share my process because this is good. So I literally just Googled Django models one to many, which brought up actually their docs are very good on this. And this is the guide code that I'm using now. And I think understanding the concept is important. Then finding some guide code is useful. And then when you're using the guide code, take the time to make sure you then really understand what's happening. And I think I may have jumped the gun a bit here, and we want something like this, and we just want to set up a foreign key. Might be the easier way to do it. And again, I'm borrowing very heavily, and I'll just share my screen and show you all exactly what I'm borrowing from, because I think it's actually a good illustration. So this is from the Django docs. They're talking about a reporter and an article, and I've seen this a bunch of times. So I'm familiar with this, and that's part of why I can use it so easily as guide code. And this is kind of what we want. A reporter can have a bunch of articles. An article, at least in this model, is only written by one reporter. And I got a little ahead of ourselves. We just need to set up a foreign key relationship and let Django models take care of the rest. And what this example says is, hey, this article, it's going to belong to a reporter. And when the reporter is deleted, delete their articles. I believe that that's the logic. So I've got that set up as sort of my basics. And let me check the chat really quickly and see if other people. Yeah, I would agree. The Django docs, some parts of the Django docs are quite good and other parts are quite confusing. That so I would agree with both people's comments around the Django docs. But I think we actually have a good start here, and I'm not sure if we need that much more to set up our many-to-one relationship with the basics. And yeah, we can add a couple things on top of this to make sort of like ease of use a little easier, but I think this is actually like a good start. What I am going to add, and let's see what we need for question. So we need to connect the question to the polls, but we'll do that in a minute. A question really just needs a title, which we've changed to description, just to make life easier and have less names to remember. And I think the one thing I'm going to add is this dunder string method. And can folks just share in the chat if they're familiar with this or not? I see a yes, a yes. We did it yesterday. Awesome. Perfect. So I think that's all we need for the description. I am getting a squiggly here because instance of question has no ID member. I'm going to ignore that. I'm pretty sure Django models will take care of that. And that is just VS Code not knowing enough about what's going on. What I'm also going to do is add a method called REPR. And this is very similar, but what this is if we have a list of question instances and we print that list out, Python actually looks for a dunder REPR method. And I'm going to set this up quickly here as well. And again, this takes a little time, but it makes life a lot easier because when we're debugging, this gives us a lot better information. Description, and we're say num responses, self number responses. So that's that. And we'll just copy that and do the same thing for the REPR is short for represent, by the way. So now we have this rolling, and I want to show something else that's pretty cool that we may have looked at, but I don't think we have. And that is the Django shell. Have we seen this before? And I could use a couple yeses or nos in the chat. Yes. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, it is a little confusing. It's very similar to the Python shell. Both of these are called like a REPL, which stands for read, evaluate, print loop. Python, by the way, if you just type Python on the command line, this gives us the Python REPL, gives us some commands here. You can print hello. You can do all the normal things that you would in Python. When I'm like doing serious work, I always have a terminal open with the Python REPL or the JavaScript REPL, so that if I forget how to do like some slicing on a list, which I forget all the time, and I want to do something fancy, I can just experiment in there very quickly. And for a lot of things, that's faster than using documentation. And I'm going to rename these so I know what's what. Python REPL. This one is server, and this one is Django REPL. And so some of you probably saw this yesterday. And actually, there is one step that I missed here that I should do, which is because I want to create some models, but I haven't run any migrations. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And before I run my migrations, I am going to get rid of all the squigglies that I can. Which does mean adding my doc string. And now we just have this self ID. And I do want to and of course, now I've gotten myself confused with all these things. Beautiful. I do want to run my migrations. And can someone remind me, like, what does that command do? What just happened there?
It populated a database with our models.
Great question. Yes, exactly. It created a bunch of tables in our database to represent these models, to store this information. It also created a file in our source code under the migrations directory. And if you poke around in here, you'll see it's just Python. And this is what Django actually did. Though I might actually have to run the migration. That would be the next thing. Now that I created it, I don't believe I actually ran it. And the reason these migration files are created is because, especially in a production application where you have a database with real data that you can't just totally delete and start over with, if something goes wrong, it's nice to be able to go back in time to a certain state in the database. And when you need to like build a new version of the whole program, say in a test environment, having these migration files lets you build your database in steps where you're guaranteed that each one of these migrations either runs successfully and you know exactly what state your database is in, or it failed. And you don't end up in a sort of fuzzy gray area. And whoever said that this is how I end up with all the terminals is totally correct. And if we go into Postgres and we connect to our polls database and we do DT, there's nothing there because what I also have to do is actually run the migrations. And I didn't get any errors, which is great. And now if I do D, a ton of stuff just got created. And this is why once you go down the road of an ORM, an object relation mapper like PsychoPG2 and Django models, where we're not touching the database, Django is, and it does all sorts of stuff under the hood. We really want to keep doing it the Django way. Like we can modify SQL directly, but we just have to be a little careful because Django does a lot of stuff for us. And this is where I really screwed up in naming my polls app. Batteries included frameworks like Django do lots of fancy things, including using the name of the app in the name of the table. And so I would have been better off just naming the app polls, because app main question is not a great name for a database table. But we're just going to have to live with it for now. Because I don't want to go back and redo stuff. But to kind of take a look at that table.
So Adam,
Can you-
real quick,
Yeah.
when you're running that make migrations command, you're basically structuring tables according to whatever's in your models.py file. And then when
Exactly.
you actually migrate them, you're taking those structures and inserting them, into the database you created.
Oh, almost. You're almost there. And that's a really good point about the two commands. So this first command as the name implies, and this is where this stuff, it's obvious once you think about it, but there's so much going on. This creates the migration file. This file 0001 underscore initial.py that lives in the migrations directory. This command looks at our models py file, and it will look all over Django if we have more than one models file, I think. And based on that, it creates this file. It generates this code. And this is Python code that uses Django, which is using PsychoPG2. And one of the nice things here, by the way, if we look through here, there's nothing in this file specific to Postgres. So there's a layer of separation. Like if we switched to a different database like MySQL or SQLite, I'm not 100%, but I think we could probably still use this migration file. And that's part of the point of Django models and these tools, is to provide sort of a bit more like flexibility. In the real world, there would be a lot more considerations, but that's part of the idea here. So this file was created that took everything we said in models here and turned it into some more code and we could write this ourselves. And in fact, sometimes you do. And Django is going to run this in a minute to actually create those tables in the database, which is where you were going. And as you can see here, it's saying, these are the fields, these are all the things. So make migrations created this migration file. When we run, and in fact, I can run it again, and it won't do anything bad because there's nothing that we changed. No changes detected. And if we look in the migrations directory, we'll see that nothing has changed. And then when we run the migrate command, this looks in the migrations directory and runs all the migrations. Django is also using its own little database somewhere in Postgres, I suspect, to keep track of which migrations have been run. or that might be being stored here in this PyCache directory. It gets a little fuzzy and it's not so relevant for us. And this again is safe because it says no migrations to apply because we already ran them. And in fact, a great thing to do with migrations, and now that we've done this, we should look at our code. I'm going to very quickly break my commits up into 2 chunks. Actually, I'm not, just because of time. And committed that. And now I have a nice clean commit that basically has a Django hello world, my question model, my response model, and the migration for it. And so if I need to go back to that commit, everything is in a good state. And taking a look at that table, and then when we ran that migrate command, it went ahead and created this table that has this stuff. And I want to check it and make sure that what I said just made sense, because I know I just did a lot of talking, so I could use a little feedback.
It did, thank you, yeah. And
Yeah,
I
that was
think
an
that was
excellent
something
question.
that was, yeah, exactly. I just wanted a concrete definition of it from when we went over it the other day, and that helps, thank you.
100%. Yeah, that was an excellent question. And like database migrations, again, it's a little trickier to experience the value of them on these smaller projects and personal projects. In group projects, it will start to become apparent. It's an incredibly valuable tool to have in the real world, because now if I really screw stuff up, I can delete the whole database, run the migrations file, and get exactly what I want again. Once you have real data, and a lot of it, it gets a bit messier, but that's the basic idea. And kind of actually connecting all these dots and going, I know I've been jumping around terminals a lot, to the Django REPL, and it doesn't have clear. So I've been so the Python REPL, we can do Python stuff. Here, the Django REPL, it's not just Python, though we should be able to do the normal Python-y things. The Django shell or the Django REPL should also give us all of the Python modules and libraries that Django has. And I am following our guide code from the lesson today, but because this one we ran with that, and actually I'll quit this and run it again just to remind people what I did. Using manage py, the Django shell, we're interacting with our Django environment. And I should be able to do something like this. From main app models import question. So it did not like that. And there's something that I am missing. I might have to do a quick little Google search here. So it should be. Yeah, let's see. Let me make sure I'm getting my names and everything right. I may have just screwed up the name here. And again, this goes back to the importance of naming. Yeah, so that did work and that didn't throw an error. So I apologize for that delay, folks. To step back, I'm running the Django shell, which means we can access all these different Python modules that are a part of Django and the things that we created. Because Django is doing some work for us here. So I don't know all the different methods, and I don't know this in depth, but the basic idea I am familiar with. So I apologize that I veered a little bit, but we can now interactively work with these models that we just created with question and response. And of the two, I think the starting point is we should probably create a question, which is really simple because it just has a description field. So let's use favorite food is my favorite example. Favorite food question equals question. Description, what is your favorite food? And this is why the Django shell is worth it. I've created an instance of this model. I use that model that I just wrote, and I can interact with it. And note it's using that string method that we wrote here. And this is going to get really nice because what we can now do, since this is an instance of a model, is save it. And now if I pop over to pSQL and I do select star from app main question, that data is actually in our database. So I know it took me a little while to get through there, but I wanted to share this because I think as you're prototyping and building something out, this is a really useful and easy tool to get some fake data in there and put some stuff in. You can do this in other ways as well. But because this is interactive, I would encourage trying this out a bit. I do think it takes a little while to get used to. And I would love feedback too if people don't find this useful. But hopefully it will be. Because now we can also do stuff like chocolate equals response. And I'm just going to do a quick I just want a shorter variable name. And I apologize, I haven't been using like good capitalization and stuff. Chocolate equals response. The one bummer of this is we're not getting great autocomplete, and that does make life more difficult. Let me make sure that response is there. It is. Yep. And if I look at my response model, it's got a description, number of responses has a default value, and a question. So it needs a description, which is just going to be chocolate. And the question is going to be food Q, and fingers crossed that works. And it did, which is great. And now if we do chocolate.save, and we go over here and we look here in response, we've got chocolate. So I just want to check in. I'm curious what people's thoughts are. Is this useful? I know I just jumped around a lot too through a bunch of different terminals. So I want to check in and see if this made sense and there's things that people would like me to go over again or not. And I know that you saw some of this, but I'm not sure how much. So I could really use some feedback.
I think it's really useful to go through really slowly and kind of explain what everything is. It's really kind of solidifying I think questions that a lot of us had in the interim parts of what everything's actually doing in the back end.
Awesome. And does what I did with the Django shell make sense? And especially as we have some guide code on how to do this, do you all feel like you could do that yourselves for an assignment or a project or something like that?
Very strong, maybe.
As long as I have this video to watch back.
That's a good start. Yeah. Yeah. And the video will definitely go up, and I'll try and find this part and timestamp it, or at least share it or something. And I'll make sure to have I'll share a good clean bit of code of the steps to do this, to make sure that will be useful as well. In that vein, it's 11:30. We've been going for a while. I think I just want to add like a couple other things just to flesh out this question, and then we can hit a pause point and we can decide if we want to break or add the poll model, or anything else. Because I feel like once we get rolling here, this is when it starts to get fun. And I actually want to open up my notes and just look at this question that we have with this fake data of favorite food. We had sushi, grilled cheese, pizza, chocolate. So in fact, I'm just going to use the up arrow and be lazy. If you really want to go wild, Control A will pop your cursor to the very beginning of the line. Pizza. And it's just criminal that the autocomplete doesn't work for these arguments here, because that would make life really easy. And I'm just going to go here and double check. And now we've got fake data. So there are you can write code to do this. It's called fixtures, or you could put all this in a file and run it as well. And in some ways that might be more efficient. This is nice though when prototyping and you can kind of interact with stuff. And this is also helpful when you're working on code to figure out how things relate to each other, because I can also do food queue dot responses. See, what is the relationship here? It might be response set. And indeed it is. So this is another bit of magic that Django does, where when you create a relationship between two models, response and question, Django adds a little field for us so that we can connect the two. And it does it by taking the name of the other model and adding set as in a group at the end. And you can set exactly what you want that name to be, but it's useful to know what its default value is. And I'm curious, if we print this, what happens? And to answer the question in the chat, that is the related name field, correct? If you set related name, then you don't have to do response set. Let's see, it might look something like objects all. So it's not quite there. So here is where I am getting a little fuzzy, but I think the main point I want to emphasize is this then lets us manipulate things in interesting ways. And connect things and put data in. So this is actually probably a good point to pause. And we should take, it's 11:37. So I'm not sure how much more we can cover. So let's definitely take a break. And before we break, is there anything that people want to chat about or look at really in the 10 minutes or so we have between now and lunch? And we could look at the related name. Oh, sorry, please.
Is it possible maybe to kind of go over a bit of what types of things we're going to have to do in the assessment over the break, just so we can maybe ask better questions about what we want to know for that? Yeah, totally. And the good news is it's going to be in line with everything that you all have seen. Give me a sec here to go to the assignment I want to share as a reference here. So this is the assignment for today. And Francisco has a review project that he's going to build and demo for all of you tomorrow. That's a similar thing. That is, I think, library books. And there's a common theme here, which you all should be noticing, which is really about, the acronym is CRUD, right? Create, read, update, destroy. We've got data, we want to model relationships, and then we want to create views and logic so that users can see things and interact with them. And that's what the assessment's going to be. I think it's going to be something like create an e-commerce application and you kind of have some room to play. So same concept. And in a lot of ways, this assignment, the review exercise, and the sort of how to read and write out implementations from a spec that we looked at this morning are all going to help with the assessment. The project for this afternoon is we're creating an app that focuses on creating cars and corresponding brands. And so you'll want to come up with your models of some cars and brands. You know, you can come up with some validation, stick some data in there, and create some pages and routes to look at stuff. And so that's really what the assessment is going to test. You're going to want to be able to create some stuff, look at some stuff, modify some stuff. I know that was a pretty broad description, but was that helpful? Maybe. I guess to get a little more specific, what I would say is you want to be comfortable spinning up a Django project. You want to be comfortable creating some models that don't have to be fancy, but something like we did with questions and polls, or here with cars and brands, or with library books, where it's really 2, maybe 3 things with you know, a one-to-one or a one-to-many relationship. You want to be able to create some routes and views so a user can look at that data and display some meaningful information about it. So you're going to be using some templates as well. And then you will want a page where you have a form essentially to modify some of that existing data and save that back to the database. Okay, that helps. Awesome. Yeah, and I know we didn't get that far in a lot of this today, but hopefully this firms up some things around models and how to organize and break up the work. And tomorrow, Francisco will be going through a full project build, doing exactly what I just described.
And with all the assessments, you get credit for each part of the feature that you implement. And so we designed them so you don't have to be 100% feature complete to get a passing score. What's everyone's comfort level right now with the idea of kind of taking on a task like I just described? And I would love maybe a couple comments in the chat of either emojis representing how you feel, or like a 5 is I'm ready to kill it, and a 1, 5 out of 10. Yeah, let's do out of 10. Yeah, I'd say 5 out of 10, 4 out of 10. That feels about right. Django week is always a big week. And we cover a lot of ground. I think focusing on the project today will be a huge help, because you will be able to put a lot of these pieces together. Yeah, and I apologize we didn't get to the views. I think that would have been good as well. Again, the good news is Francisco will definitely do like a full walkthrough of those things. And I know that you all saw a little bit of the view stuff. If I can, I might whip up a bit of view logic, but I honestly, I probably won't be able to today, unfortunately. I think what you'll find is that, like, as you get comfortable with each piece, the next one gets easier. Like, and the more comfortable you are with building out the models and these things, then that just gives you more time and energy to focus on the next step. So again, I think 4 or 5 out of 10 in terms of comfort level feels right. And that's why we've kind of got today and this review exercise and the long weekend to work on these. With everything, I believe the passing score, it's either a 70 or 75%, and you can also retest. So there's a lot of room to maneuver here. So I'd say feeling nervous is about right, and I would just encourage everyone to trust in the process, and I think you all will do well. Is there anything that it would be good for us to go over around models, or creating models, or using the Django shell?
Hey, Adam.
Yeah, what's up?
The one thing we haven't gotten to that I know is going to come up as a difficulty, because I still struggle with it, even haven't seen it before, is processing the posts. So if they want us to have the forms on the websites that post data back to the database, playing with the models, making them in the Python shell is a start. But
Yeah.
one of the guys talked about one of the views. The form pages is going to be something new for everybody. And I think it's just a quick demo of how to do the forms in Django and post that data now that we have the
Got it.
models on the back end. I think that's the next step. It's really going to link it together for everybody.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's dive into that right now. That's a great call. Thank you. So I think what I'm just going to do is, we have a question, we have a route. Give me a moment to think about the quickest way to hack this one together. Let's do something like this. We're going to we're in the app here. We're going to add a path, and that path is going to be for a poll. And that's going to go to a views. We're just going to call it take poll. And in fact, that's what I'll name the route as well for consistency. And let's make a view function here. We'll call this view poll, and I'll worry about if we have to rename this or add another route in a moment. Yeah, I may not be able to do this more after lunch, unfortunately. So I apologize, and that's why I think I want to dive into it now. And I think we should set up our route something like this. Actually, I'm not even going to worry about this because we only have a little bit of sample data and we only have a couple questions. So I'm just going to hard code all of this into our view
I have a
function.
question about
Yeah.
something. On GitHub, there's a week 6, day 4 Django pulls out lesson plan. Does that, and it looks like it has a lot of it looks like the whole thing we probably should have built this morning. Is that something we can go through and work through ourselves and see the form and, you know, how the data gets transferred around the database?
It is, and it's what I'm using as a guide. And that sort of was the lesson plan for today. I think right now, I think it will be good for me to put something together for everyone to see. And I also want to share again, the review exercise that Francisco is leading tomorrow morning is, in fact, let me just go ahead and give everyone a preview of it. Very similar to some of this stuff and will help a lot. And I apologize. I didn't realize we hadn't seen as much of this stuff with forms, but essentially a full build out of viewing books, checking out books, and work very similar to what we're talking about today and would look at the assessment.
Unfortunately, the polls app on here gets to the form in terms of submitting a result, which is working with the posts on here, but it doesn't go into a sample view for making a question or adding results to it and adding that to the database. Maybe one of the TAs wouldn't mind going through a simple example on that. It wouldn't have to be with this. It could be with this polls app. It could be with something else. Cars and brands is going to get into that because they want us to make views that create a new car, create a new brand. So it's
Yeah.
at least going to be covered. It's about to come up. That's all.